Hello, good afternoon. Today I'll be speaking about tigers, as the title suggests. My presentation is broken into 9 fragments, and it's speaking about the tiger as a motif, which has been running through some of the works that I've produced in the last few years. So I'll start now with the first fragment called Leaf. A tree-of-life puppet, known in Indonesia as kayon or gunagan, appears at the opening of a wayang kulit or shadow puppet theater performance, much like the front curtain in Western theater. The general design of this puppet, a tree within a leaf, functions to remind the audience that the whole is present in its part. I would like now to draw your attention to the scene represented on the leaf itself, a confrontation between 2 iconic animals of the Indonesian world, the tiger and the water buffalo, or kerbau in Indonesian. The clash between these 2 animals were, in the 17th century, ritually staged as public spectacles by the Javanese courts of the state of Mataram. But what the tiger and the buffalo represented depended on who was looking. In the eyes of the court, the tiger was a rival power. It was the king of wilderness and the lord of chaos. The court rooted for the buffalo, which stood for the solid values of civilization. To the peasant, the buffalo was plow animal. It embodied the life-giving force of agriculture. The tiger was untamed nature. But I guess that to the peasant, the tiger must have also evoked the court, the apex predator that consumes without producing. However, the meaning of the tiger in tiger-buffalo fights would shift again in the era of Dutch colonization. The tiger, for court and peasant alike, would now stand for the European colonists. We see here the shadows of some puppets caught on a screen, a detail from the set of a theater performance that I made in 2014 called 10,000 Tigers. The Indonesian and Malaysian name for shadow puppet theater is wayang kulit. Wayang refers to theater, but it also evokes the sense of ghost, shadow, or the imagination. Kulit means skin, and at one moment in the performance, the screen lifts to reveal the puppets carved out of buffalo skin, traditionally with tools that are made of buffalo horn. Then, a projector turns on, using these puppets as the support for a projected image derived from an 1885 print of an original drawing. Titled Interrupted Road Survey in Singapore by the German artist Heinrich Leutemann. This drawing depicts an 1835 survey mission by the British in the Singaporean forest that was disrupted by the sudden emergence of a Malayan tiger. In a decade, an all-out war between tigers and humans would erupt, leading to the eventual extinction of the tigers in Singapore. In this image, we see the opposition between the civilizing mission of the white colonial surveyor on one hand and wild, untamed nature on the other. But in the local animistic cosmology, tigers were thought to be related by blood to humans in the distant horizon of an ancestral past, and they were also regarded as mediums for ancestral spirits. The dispersal of tigers across Southeast Asia took place more than 1 million years ago, long before the emergence of Homo sapiens. And when early human settlers first arrived in the region some 20,000 years ago, many of them favored as their habitat the transitory zones between the forest and the waters, an ecotone also occupied by other large ground-dwelling mammals like the deer and the boar, as well as the tiger that preyed upon them. Humans did not yet have the capacity to dominate this savanna-like landscape, for which the tiger was so perfectly adapted. To live in such a terrain, humans had to attune themselves to the ways of the tiger, a process that brought about a fusion between the two species. We have been looking at video stills from 2 or 3 tigers, an ongoing project that I began in 2015, featuring computer-generated figures or rigs animated by a human performer through motion capture, using the metamorphic capacity of digital image-making processes to facilitate this fusion between humans and tigers. In parts of the Malay world, the tiger was believed to live in villages where the houses have walls of human skin and roofs that are made of human hair. The first written record of the Malayan weretiger comes from an early 15th century Chinese source. The triumphant visions of the shores of the oceans, written by Ma Huan, who served as an interpreter to Admiral Cheng Ho, the great navigator eunuch of Ming Dynasty China. Of his visit to Malacca, Ma Huan wrote, "In the town, there are tigers which can assume human form. They enter the markets and walk about, mixing with the populace. If anyone recognized one of these creatures, he would seize it and kill it." It was said that a tiger can dissolve itself into human shape in the midst of crossing rivers, which made me think of what the French philosopher Bataille described as the being of an animal in the world. He said, "The being of an animal in the world is that of water in water." Water is in Southeast Asia the prime element, featuring in almost all its originary myths. It is a liminal element, a lubricant for metamorphosis, facilitating the change of states. It is said that should a body of water not be close at hand for the would-be weretiger, he can instead perform 3 somersaults, drawing in the air the sign of the swastika, the symbol of water, the whirlpool, the eternal return. Let's return to 1835, to the interrupted road survey in Singapore. This particular survey of 1835 was undertaken in preparation for a new road to be cut through the forest to accommodate the increasing number of gambia and pepper plantations brought on by rising European demands. Both gambia and pepper are cash crops that were highly destructive, requiring huge amounts of timber to process. Gambia involved the constant boiling of the leaves, while pepper required kiln drying. This resulted in the destruction of the surrounding forests for firewood. Some species, such as the wild boar, thrived in the new environment with the extra foraging opportunities that such plantations offered, and thus also thrived the tigers that preyed upon them. But some tigers also began developing a taste for domestic livestock, dogs, and sometimes human beings. Miraculously, it was reported that no humans were harmed in this encounter with the tiger. Only the Theodolite, the toppling instrument in the center of the image, was reported to have been destroyed to bits. The Theodolite was an instrument used for the measuring of the angles of horizontal and vertical planes, a necessary tool for the rationalization of space. The Theodolite was one of the most expensive instruments required for these costly survey missions. And this particular Theodolite belonged to the surveyor named George Dromgold Coleman. Coleman was a highly accomplished civil architect and land reclaimer of Irish extraction. In 1835, Coleman was appointed the Superintendent of Public Works in Singapore, and he became responsible for reclaiming large plots of land from the sea and river marshes, extending the town, as well as designing many notable civic buildings in classic Palladian style, most notably St. Andrew's, which was the first church in the settlements. But Coleman was also the superintendent of convicts in Singapore. Most of the convicts that he dealt with were Indians sentenced to what was known as transportation, which meant a term in overseas prisons in other parts of the British Empire. This was also a life of indentured labor, for convicts were employed in all aspects of public works, the draining of marshes, the building of roads, and also in surveys, where they served as chainmen, survey assistants, and land measurers. And in these missions, they sometimes encountered the tiger. It was precisely these Indian convicts that had made up Coleman's entourage in the survey mission of 1835. And it was also them who built almost all the buildings that Coleman had designed, including the first church in Singapore. And in 1844, when brick prices soared, the colonial administration would even get the prisoners to produce the very bricks with which they would build the civic buildings. In Singapore, in 1860, the prisoners were assigned to the construction of a building that, upon close to completion, took on the form of a prison. It was at that moment that the prisoners realized that they were building their own future jail. Coleman's twin duties of public works and supervising convicts conflated a model of empire building that can be described as Herculean, in the sense that among Hercules' famous 12 labors were these same symbols of economic development: the clearing of land, the draining of swamps, and the development of agriculture, as well as the domestication of livestock, the establishment of commerce, and the introduction of technology. One of Hercules' most iconic missions was his second labor, the destruction of the Hydra of Lerna. When he lopped off one of the Hydra's heads, 2 new ones grew in its place. As the historians Linnebaugh and Weretigers noted, the Hydra in the European imagination stood for disorder and resistance. The Hydra was a powerful threat to the building of state, empire, and capitalism, and was often employed in parliament and in print as a metaphor for describing the difficulty of imposing order on increasingly global systems of labor. The life of one of these convicts took the form of a kind of traveling without moving. Under confinement, they drifted across the Indian Ocean and circulated throughout British Malaya. When Bencoolen, on the southwestern coast of Sumatra, was conceded to the Dutch by the London Treaty of 1825, 800 to 900 of these Indian convicts were distributed amongst the 3 settlements of Penang, Malacca, and Singapore. In Singapore, the prisoners were motivated by a system of rewards and promotions. To be promoted meant becoming a warder over one's fellow prisoners before being finally released into the colony as citizens. For many of these convicts, this was a journey of no return. The experience of this transportation was to be sent across what was known as the Kala Pani, or the black water, in which their former lives were to be dissolved like water in water. The architecture of the prisons in colonial Singapore differed from the radial plan of the panoptic model designed for isolation. Instead, it resembled the system of the dormitory. The prisoner was a worker with homogenized diet and labor regimes. prisoners of all castes were mixed together, which the administrators considered an additional safeguard and protection against any possible combined revolt. For it was their cynical belief that one caste would invariably betray another. In these convict shops that they called the Jeta Junaza, or living tomb, these Indian prisoners of all castes were mixed together so closely that for a person of caste, it meant constant defilement and thus perpetual excommunication from his own kin. The Singaporean prison had a reputation for being progressive in the ways that the convicts were rendered productive. It was the first Indian jail to introduce a steam-powered sawmill and pulp mill for manufacturing. A printing press was used in printing and bookbinding and published documents for various government departments, including the Government Gazette. J.F.A. McNair, the Controller General of Convicts, wrote in his memoirs titled Prisoners Their Own Warders, that upon learning photography in 1861, he taught photography to 2 literate convicts whom he put to work in a specially constructed photographic studio inside Singapore jail, which provided services to Europeans who might want to have their portraits taken. But these prisoners also produced a series of photographs of their fellow prisoners, some of which survive in the memoirs of McNair. The pictures include various categories or types of convicts, from 5th-class incorrigibles to 1st-class overseers, timekeepers, and clerks. As Claire Anderson noted, these photographs unconsciously mirrored the ethnographic projects simultaneously underway in the Indian subcontinent and in British Malaya. In 1899, the English anthropologist Walter William Skeat entered deep into the forested heart of Singapore. In 1906, he published his major book, The Pagan Races of the Malay Peninsula, which included the first photograph of a Malay weretiger. By the 20th century, beliefs in weretiger has been relegated to the realm of folklore and kitsch, following the widespread upheavals of landscapes under the British colonial rule, as well as the tiger extermination campaigns carried out in Singapore, which began very soon after Coleman's encounter with the tiger. Nevertheless, tigers continued to have a great hold upon the imaginary landscape of the region, and tigers would incessantly return to haunt the region. In December 1941, the Japanese 25th Army invaded Malaya. Moving swiftly through the forest, savage, amphibious, and full of guile and battle, the Japanese forces embodied the very qualities that had made the tiger such a feared adversary of the early British settlers. The Japanese 25th Army were led by Japanese General Tomoyoki Yamashita, who was widely known as the Tiger of Malaya. Lieutenant General Takuma Nishimura, the second-ranking officer, was known as the Other Tiger of Malaya. The principal resistance in Malaya against the Japanese occupation was the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army, a guerrilla organization under the leadership of the Malayan Communist Party. When the Japanese forces surrendered in 1945 and left Malaya, the epithet of tiger gradually transferred to the communists, who now constituted a very real threat to the returning British forces, which were deflated and weakened by the war. However, these communist tigers eventually retreated deep into the forest, along with the other spirits and myths that were believed to take shelter in the Malayan forests. The British responded by intensifying their regulation of forested zones, offering cash bounties, organizing hunts, and ambushes, similar strategies previously employed to annihilate the Malayan tigers. And in the shadows of the dense tropical forests, the British hunters of communist guerrillas sometimes found themselves coming face to face with tigers instead. And with this, I will end the presentation. Thank you.